Good evening, gentlemen. I'm going to talk about the global scenario which is now prevalent all over the world. If you will remember, the last World War ended in 1945 when Adolf Hitler committed suicide. And about 2 months later, the Americans dropped two atomic bombs on Japan, and that was the end of Japan. It was over, bar the shouting. Well, at that time, at the end of 1945, there were two major powers in the world, and one was the USSR, which was led by Joseph Stalin, and the other was the United States. Western Europe had almost been destroyed, and Eastern Europe was under the thumb of the Russians. Gentlemen, the situation continued like that for about 4 decades. But thanks to a plan which the Americans had made, which is called the Marshall Plan, named after George Marshall, who was the one of the top official, I think, Secretary of State of the United States, the Americans were able to pump in millions of dollars into Western Europe, and Europe began to thrive thanks to the American effort. But in contrast, the Russian Empire, that is the USSR, ran into deep economic troubles. There was no innovation, and particularly after the death of Stalin and then Nikita Khrushchev to some extent, the Russians didn't have a proper leader. They had weak men coming in, like Chernenko and some others. Even Brezhnev miscalculated very badly. With the result, the economy was in dire straits, and they played into the hands of the Americans in the sense that the situation became so bad, and one of the Russian presidents, Gorbachev, introduced what is known as freedom or Petroska, which means a degree or a modicum of freedom from the central authority. But that was a very dangerous thing to do in a state which was a unitary state, and Russia broke up into 18 states, rather 18 countries. Suddenly, a bipolar world became a unipolar world with only one superpower, that is the United States. And after the demise of the USSR, Russia had not been able to recover at all. But all the same, during this period, right up to 1992, there was what is called detente. That means live and let live. And I thought that was the best period as far as the 20th century was concerned, because there's not much of fighting going on between the two power blocks. Of course, the Americans were fighting small wars, local wars. They fought in Vietnam, they fought in Korea, then later on they went and fought in Afghanistan. All that is okay. But there was no confrontation with the Soviet Union. The collapse of Russia, this USSR, saw a success state come in, and that was the Russian state. They claimed to be a democracy, though their type of democracy is quite different from the type which is prevalent, say, in India or England or the United States. But definitely there was some sort of democracy, and the Russians finally began to make some progress. But they had lost their world power status. Russia's world power status was compensated by the rise of communist China. Mao Zedong was a visionary. I mean, a lot of people think he was the butcher of China. I also think so. Because when he was the leader of the Chinese Revolution and then the chairman of the Communist Party, he was instrumental in about 20 to 30 million Chinese going to the next world. They were killed. There was mass famine, and some of his policies were absolutely absurd. But he had a single point plan, and that was to make China great. And this is where the Americans came in. The Americans were mighty scared of the Russians at that time, that is the early 60s, so they gave a nod for China to go nuclear way back in 64 when Lyndon Johnson was the president, and China became a nuclear power. In addition, they thought at that time, when Richard Nixon was the president and America was embroiled in a fruitless Vietnam War, that it is better that we get on the Chinese side, or rather ask the Chinese to come on our side, so that we can be partners and finish Russia in any case. Because Russia at that time was the dominant power in the world. Russia, in fact, collapsed in 92. The USSR collapsed and the successor state was Russia. At the same time, China had begun its rise up. The Chinese were a totalitarian society, but they adopted capitalist methods of production. With the result, the American companies, the big corporations, they flooded to China with millions of dollars of money, technology, including high-grade artificial intelligence, computers and whatnot, and big companies like corporations like Apple, they made a beeline for China because labor was cheap and the goods produced were cheaper than anywhere else in the world, and these companies began to make a profit. But the Chinese were very clever. They allowed all this to continue. At the same time, the Chinese did something which the Americans never expected. They covered two generations and became the second biggest economy in the world. As on date, this economy is about $18 trillion to the Americans, which are about $24 trillion. Of course, as per the per capita income, they're still pretty low, but China has become a formidable power, and now it's like an ogre, and the Americans realized that they had created a Frankenstein. You all know who Frankenstein was. He was an artificial creation, and then he became bigger than the living persons. Same thing has happened there. The Americans helped China, and China has now gone ahead, and China is now an antagonist to the Americans. So when the 21st century came in, the situation had greatly changed from what was in 45. The USSR was finished, but it was replaced by China, and at the same time, China was very belligerent. It wanted to get back its lost glory. If you remember, history tells us that China was the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world in the 15th and 16th century. And China wanted to restore that situation back, make China the center of the world. And they went about in a very devious method. They gave a lot of licenses and facilities to the foreigners, big corporations to come to China. They came, made their profit, but then the Chinese took away their technology. They did what is called reverse engineering and produced their own items, which though slightly inferior than the Western ones, in any case served the purpose, and China flooded the world market. At the moment, I think as far as the world is concerned, 135 countries in the world, main trading partner is China. That's a big deal. And America has a trade of about $600 to $700 billion with China, which is about weighted in favor of China by about $400 billion. So America may have military might, but has become dependent on China economically. At the same time, the American president committed some big mistake at that time, thinking in the hope that China would play subservient to them and help them dominate the world. They gave a tacit invitation to the Chinese to go ahead and occupy the South China Sea, which the Chinese duly did. And now the Chinese are claiming the entire South China Sea, and any decision by the Hague, the International Court of Justice, has been caught by the Chinese and thrown into the South China Sea. China is now claiming about 80% of the South China Sea area. And the little states like Vietnam and the Philippines and others are hard pressed. They can't face China. They're looking to America to help. But America facilitated the rise of China in the South Pacific, rather Eastern Pacific. If you remember, there was a Philippine president called Duterte, and he had said that the Americans are the one who gave everything away to China. And in case they were serious to oppose China, way back in the beginning of the 21st century, they could have sent half a dozen aircraft carriers to the South China Sea and restored the status quo ante. Americans didn't do that. And now they have one or destroyer running here and there, to showing freedom of navigation exercises and all that, but it gets no meaning really. That means the Chinese got a carte blanche from America to rise up. Similarly, America was playing a very devious game in the Middle East. They were backing Israel to the hilt, which is very correct because Israelis have suffered a lot during the Second World War, when about 60 million Jews were killed in the gas chambers by Adolf Hitler. So as a part of atonement, the world decided to give them the Israeli state, which was carved out of Arab lands in the Middle East, Palestine to be exact. But this was bound to create a problem, and it has created a problem because the Arab world felt that their rights had been taken away. But then the Arabs are not united because many of them are pro-America and some of their economies are subsidized by America totally, including their defense, for example. Jordan's economy is subsidized by America. Even Egypt, highly dependent on America. Saudi Arabia, totally dependent on America for defense and other purposes. So, America had a big pie. So, America tried to play an even-handed game there in the Middle East. And that even-handed game was that they were fueling money, thousands of dollars, into the accounts of the PLO, which actually runs the Gaza state. And this money was flowing into a terrorist organization called Hamas. Americans knew about it. But they were thinking Hamas not going to do anything drastic. And they would continue firing one or two rockets here and there and attack a border post or something like that. But then Iran, which had been feeling that it had been greatly wronged by the Americans, who had put the Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, on the throne in 1954 by a coup by the CIA, and he had ruled with an iron hand in the sense that the dissidents were just caught and put in a helicopter, taken to a height of about 5,000 to 6,000 feet and thrown from the helicopter. This is a fact. So the Ayatollahs and the others finally had their say. There was the Iranian Revolution, and America lost all influence in Iran. Similarly, the Americans lost all influence in Baghdad, in Iraq, and they did the mistake in trying to remove, or rather mistake in removing Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, who were men who were against the ISI, and they got them executed by dubious methods. So you can see the game plan of the Americans. They were not really clear in their ideas. They didn't know who were their friend and who were their foe. And the net result was that the Americans even could not decide whether the Palestinians are their foe or their friends or what are they. Donald Trump, when came as president in 2016, he was a different kettle of fish. He started by realizing the danger of his militant Islam as well as the danger which Pakistan posed, and he was very vociferous about it. And he also stopped the migration or the entry into the United States of a number of Muslim countries. But then everything has a limit, and somehow or the other, I would not digress what happened, but he lost the election in 2024, and the man who came into power was Joe Biden. Now, Biden, is a man who was the vice president for a long time under Obama. Now, in my opinion, the decline of America really commenced when Clinton and then later Obama became the president. Obama had gone to a Muslim school, a madrasa, in his childhood. His father was a Muslim, And though he had converted to the Catholic faith, I don't think he really convinced about it. And in heart of hearts, he had a grudge against Israel. He was a pro Islamic individual as well. So many things he did. And Biden grew up under his shadow. 8 years he did nothing in particular when he was the vice president with Obama. And when he got on his own back, his own cake, his call it as President of America, he immediately reversed all the policies of Donald Trump. The migration of the Muslim countries was restored. He began to show that I'm even-handed, and even he began to criticize India for lack of freedom of religion and all that crap, And then he decided that the funding which had been stopped by Donald Trump of the PLO would be restored, and he began to do that. I think the Americans are playing a double game. It should be very clear that when you want to fight something, you fight whole hog. You don't just do half measures. And these half measures had no really relevance of what's happening, because the Americans are not clear of what is happening in the world. And then the Americans also were very scared even at that stage that they didn't want Russia to become a power at all. The Americans wanted to dominate the world, a unipolar world. They thought it's a good idea to break Russia further into 3 or 4 states and at the same time surround Russia by NATO countries. Now, NATO is a paper tiger. This the Americans didn't realize it. But they thought the threat of NATO surrounding Russia would be enough to break Russia into another 3 or 4 states. Maybe some more portions of Russia would break away, and America's hegemony in Europe would be complete. So they began to expand NATO despite a promise by President Clinton that they would not expand eastwards, but they expanded eastwards, and even the small Baltic countries like Estonia and Latvia, etc., were all made members of NATO. They made even Poland a member of NATO, and they were going ahead to make Ukraine a member of NATO. The idea was to ring Russia, at the same time bring Russia on its knees. And they were pretty certain that if in case the Russians do something drastic, they would take them out of the world economic order and Russia would collapse. See, this is all easier said than done. The Russian president, Vladimir Putin, though not in the same class as Stalin, probably saw through the game, and there was a time when he probably felt that the limit had been reached and he launched an invasion of Ukraine. Well, it was well-known fact to Putin that the Americans and NATO are not going to allow the Russians a free hand in Ukraine, so they began to pump in billions of dollars worth of weapons, technology, and with the result, Ukraine began to give a fight to the Russians. Russians had a lot of bad strategic planning in the sense that they allowed Ukraine to get on the hook by not launching a full-scale invasion from day one. And they talked of limited military engagement, which didn't lead anywhere. And that resulted they had to retreat from Kyiv and Kharkiv and came back in the Donbass region, but they haven't achieved anything further than what they had earlier. Though they have taken about 25% of the territory, but the war of attrition is on. But the bigger fact is that America has not been able to win the Ukraine war. They have already bloodied their nose in Afghanistan, where they left millions of dollars worth of weapons there behind, including their supporters. And so Biden was trying to make amends to show that he could win in Ukraine and maybe then win the 24 election by saying, look, I got victory in Ukraine. It's not happened that way. Though Russia has been taken out of the SWIFT payment system, there's been a lot of sanctions on Russia. But then when a man is pushed to the wall and Russia has resources, the biggest gas and natural resources in Russia, including oil, the Russians had to gravitate, and they gravitated closer to China and Russia. China had an axe to grind because the Americans were not honoring their provinces as far as Taiwan is concerned, because Nixon had accepted a one China policy at that time. But the Americans continued supporting Taiwan. And even Biden has made a statement that if China attacks Taiwan, the Americans will fight China. It's easier said than done. They need somebody to help them fight. because the Americans don't have the manpower to match the Chinese, and that is the reason they are quoting Narendra Modi in India as a counterweight to China. India, of course, cannot be a counterweight to China. It doesn't have the same technology, the firepower, the military. But at the same time, in case you add the American military technology, then India becomes an essential threat to China. So Modi has to play his cards very carefully. And now in the Middle East, the Arabs are feeling that things are not moving forward, it's a status quo. And the last war they fought was in 73, and Iran had been planning something drastic which they've all been doing. They've been scared of America, if you remember. Just after the Iranian Revolution, they took the entire American diplomatic corps as hostage and kept them for almost a year or two. And they only released them when some millions of dollars were paid to the Iranians. Gentlemen, the situation thus, if I've given you a global picture, is terrible. Europe is in problem. Middle East is a problem. There's a problem in the eastern regions of China. And in Africa also, the civil war on, the ISIS and other Islamist groups are operating in Central Africa. And the French were there. They had the presence because they thought they're omnipotent. But then, as the last coup in Gabon has shown, the French have been thrown out. They've had to leave and go. And then we had the Monroe Doctrine, which had been made by the American President Monroe, who had said that South America is part of our backyard, our realm. That's also gone because Cuba came in, anti-America. Venezuela is also not in favor of America. And so things are not all that honky-dory for the Americans. They need a dynamic leader. It's a tragedy that Donald Trump lost the election. Otherwise, things perhaps would have been different. Now, gentlemen, there is a war on in the Middle East, and Israel is just thinking that it has to finish Hamas once for all. Now, I think you can finish Hamas, but you can't finish the idea behind Hamas. And that idea could germinate into something else. See, ISIS, the Islamic State, was destroyed, but then the extremism has not ended. And Donald Trump did something very good. He had the Abrahamic Accord. He got 4 Arab nations to sign it. 2 nations earlier recognized Israel. So a substantial portion of the Arab world has recognized Israel. But the Iranians were not keen on this. That is why they launched this offense against Israel, hoping that Israel will show no tolerance, attack Hamas, and that would consolidate the Arab world. That is the game. Now the Americans are wondering what to do. They have positioned 2 aircraft carriers in the eastern Mediterranean. Warships are there, aircraft are there. But the question is, how much can America intervene in the Gaza conflict? The Israelis have not yet launched their offensive, but I have a feeling that they will launch it at some stage, because if they give up now, it means giving breathing space to Hamas, and the second round with Hamas won't be very far off. Gentlemen, the world is now in a state of flux. You have a fight on in Ukraine, and you have a battle on in the Middle East. Iran is a belligerent nation. Afghanistan has gone the way of extremism, and China is flexing its muscles. It's claiming a lot of area of India. In addition, it's claiming the entire South China Sea, and claim also over Taiwan, which it claims is a renegade province and must come back to China. Because after all, the American President Nixon is the one who put forward and accepted the one China principle when he made peace with China. I would say it was not a peace, it was just he threw in the towel, because he realized America could not win in Vietnam, so he thought he'd be very clever, get the Americans on their side so that he'd keep part of South Vietnam as part of America. It didn't happen that way. The North Vietnamese mounted an offensive which the Americans lived to regret, and they had to retreat. They are poignant pictures of the last days of American retreat from Saigon. Gentlemen, the situation is thus heading towards what is called a conflagration. And the situation has never been so dicey as it was, because so long as the USSR and America were the two omnipotent powers, right up to 1990, the world was a safer place. It's not now. At the turn of the century, and now almost within the last 10 years or 15 years, there's been a tremendous backlash all over the world, and the Americans are at the receiving end. I think if America had a great leader like, say, Roosevelt, things would have been different. They had one man, Donald Trump. He was a good man, but he's been voted out of power. And now what about the future? The future is very dark, at least for the Western world. And it's about time the West realized that you can't have the cake and eat too. You've been eating it for 400 years, denuding South Africa and other countries in Africa of trillions of dollars, stripping India of their wealth, subjugating China, but all that's over. And now the West is in serious problems. And if the West does not pull up its socks, it's going to be just eaten away by an Islamic wave. As you're aware, hundreds of thousands of Islam's followers, refugees, are converging on the way Western Europe. And the Europeans don't know what to do about it, and they have a shortage of manpower. Their birth rate is low, they can't sustain the population, they need labor, and this is supplied by the migrants from the Middle East and North Africa. So it's a dicey situation. I don't see any way Europe can survive. It's going to be a very tough time for Europe to survive. America is still the omnipotent power, but the Americans, if they continue their flagrant policies of giving away billions of dollars and fighting ceaseless wars, they're going to sap the American economy. And a day might well come when the American economy collapses like a house of cards. Is a possibility. And then even the Arabs are now wary of America. They don't know which way America is going to turn, with whom America is going to fight. And they know that Israel is the linchpin of the American effort in the Middle East. Gentlemen, in such a situation, I can't hazard a guess. Perhaps, you see, the whole thing depends on who comes to power in 2024. Because the man who's going to set the agenda in the world is the American president. He's the one man who's going to set the agenda. And you need a dynamic man there. And you get another Joe Biden getting for another term, that would be the end of American civilization. Well, gentlemen, I'll close now. It's been a World War year, I feel. You must remember that World War means a war over the world, and now with so many hotspots all over, and not forgetting, I haven't mentioned about the fact in the Caucasus there's also a fight on between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So you name it. There's a war tension between India and China. That's also part of the scheme of things. Though I think China is a little wise not to antagonize India and fight with India. It's going to gain nothing out of it. Well, gentlemen, let's see what happens in the years to come. I hope you enjoy my video. Like it and share it with your friends. Come back for more. I look forward to your interaction with you, and take care, and God bless. Thank you.